Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest for this four-part series is Alan Brill. Alan is Senior Managing Director, Cyber Risk at Kroll, a corporate services firm specializing in valuations, cyber risk, corporate finance, and regulatory compliance, among other services. Alan founded the firm's high-tech investigations practice. He's also a frequent writer, speaker, and instructor on cyber and technology security, and has appeared on a variety of media outlets, including 60 Minutes, Dateline NBC, Good Morning America, and CNN. During this series, sponsored by Springer Nature, Alan and I will be discussing the state of cybersecurity in higher education, particularly the risks facing colleges and universities and their libraries, faculty, students, and administrators. We'll also be looking at opportunities for libraries to cooperate with other groups across the campus in a collective defense against digital intruders. In this second episode, Alan defines cybersecurity, its scope, and how it's evolved over the years. We'll also begin to look at some of the practical approaches individuals and institutions can take to protect themselves.
So when we think of cybersecurity, we usually imagine a lone hacker weaseling their way into government information or gaining access to someone's bank information or identity. But academic institutions are, in fact, a perfect environment for cyber attacks. Why do you think that is? What are cyber attackers looking for at a university?
There are several reasons to look at a college or university with great fondness if you're a cyber criminal. Number one is information. They have access to massive amounts of non-public information, which the hackers don't have access to, and which they don't want to pay to have access to, or be identified as having that access. So, to the extent that my being able to spoof my way into a library as an authorized user, it gives me access to stuff that I wouldn't otherwise have access to. The second reason goes to the connectivity, and that is if I can breach the library, can I move within the network to other places that I might be interested in, like the bursar's office? Can I intercept credit card payments? Can I change grades for a fee? The damage that can be done to a university by something like ransomware is also almost incalculable. What are you going to do if your entire curriculum for your entire online program is suddenly encrypted? What are you going to do if it's about the time for graduation and all of the transcript data is suddenly gone?
Mm-hmm.
Those are the kind of risks that the criminal community understands very well and want to take advantage of, simply because the more that they can whipsaw you into desperation, the more likely it is that you're going to pay the ransom, and you're going to pay it quickly, and you're not going to have too many questions about how much it is.
Right. What about foreign actors sort of at a governmental level that might be interested in, for example, the research that a university is conducting, not just, ransomware purposes, but, spying, for example?
Cyber espionage has become probably the most dominant form of international espionage, simply because it's easier and safer.
Hmm.
You don't have to cross national borders physically. You don't have to put yourself in a situation where a nation's law enforcement can physically grab you, because you're not there. You've never been there. And the ability to get into a research network and to see in real time or near real time what's going on, what's being tested, how are those tests going. Not only are those kinds of data useful to governments for espionage, but also consider that they have an economic value. If a university is engaged in a clinical drug trial and you can find out by hacking into the university how that trial is going, there may be a real economic benefit if you know that, for example, the trial is not going well, to short that stock
Right.
as opposed to, let's buy that stock now before the wonderful results of a new, anti-cancer drug becomes public. So, and you think about it, you have national governments out to get you. You have economic criminals out to get you. You have hackers out to get you. It kind of gets lonely on the defensive side.
Lonely. It feels like it's getting more crowded.
On the other side,
Oh, on the other, yeah, yeah,
lots of opponents, not that many defenders. And that
right.
really brings us to the other truth about cybersecurity. And that is that the attackers can use an enormously broad range of attacks, high tech and low tech, to try to get into a system.
Hmm.
As defenders, they only have to beat us once.
Right. That's true. Do you see libraries and universities on a broader scale becoming more frequent targets in recent years? If so, why?
We actually see universities as becoming targets because their data is vulnerable and valuable.
Hmm.
And sometimes they're a direct target. Sometimes they're a target because they're part of a statewide communication system, and it's just convenient to get from wherever you started into the university and exploit that. But, we've seen for years that the bad guys understand universities at least as well as we do, and that they understand the range of opportunity for somebody who can steal or deal with information from a university environment. And it is a target rich environment for the
Hmm.
bad guys.
Yeah.
Once you understand that as a university, it starts to become more evident that you need to devote resources to cybersecurity. You have to take it seriously. It's not just, can I get a few part-time students working on their scholarships to help out, but I have to have a professional organization. And I have to be able to operate 24 by 7 by 365 because universities are now not just physical instrumentalities, but they're online instrumentalities, and they're online constantly for students maybe all over the world, students working 24 hours a day on different projects. And once you understand the scope of the risk, you have to start asking the question, are we matching our preventive and detective tools to that risk? And
Hmm.
if we're not, why not? And what are we going to do about it?
Right. I'd like to look at sort of threats coming from outside or in versus inside. Do you see attacks coming from outside the institution's wall or inside? I mean, what does an insider attack look like?
An insider attack is interesting in that I think over time we've come to not understand the definition. An insider attack used to be, well, it's an employee, but that's, kind of 1970s, 1980s thinking,
Hmm.
because now it's a lot more than employees, isn't it?
Yep.
We have contractors. We have vendors. We have business partners with whom we work. We have organizations that provide us with information that we then distribute to our students and our faculty and our employees. So, an insider is really any individual to whom we grant privileges,
Hmm.
whether they're an employee, whether they're a contractor, whether they're a vendor. I mean, consider a hack that occurred a couple of years ago involving the retailer Target. That was tracked back to a compromised attack at a vendor which was responsible for the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems at some of the stores. And they were able to use that to gain access to the network where you would assume an HVAC vendor would need access. But because of the way that the system was configured, they were able to transit within the system and they got to the point of sale equipment and they were able to compromise that. So it's not something that you would necessarily say, well, obviously there's a connection between the air conditioning and heating systems and accepting credit cards, for tuition. But in that case, there were. So it really is a matter of understanding connectivity
Hmm.
and the fact that the bad guys are very good at exploiting any connectivity that they can get to in a system. And you need to then feed that back to make sure that you've isolated the parts of your network from one another until and unless you can pretty much prove that the connection is both needed and valid.
Right. So I imagine part of the process of exploiting an institution involves taking advantage of vulnerabilities within software that the institution uses. I mean, I'm thinking like what might some practical advice be to help librarians, fend off threats like this? And one could be just simply to make sure you're updating your software, including all the patches as they roll out. What might some other advice be in that vein?
Bill, you've hit the first one right on the head.
Hmm.
When you look at some of the recent major zero-day attacks, things that nobody knew were a vulnerability until they happened, involving either something like Solar Winds or the Microsoft Exchange server hack, within a very short period, the manufacturers released patches to immunize the system against the attack. And everybody felt relief, except what we found is that people were not applying those patches quickly.
Right.
And when you looked a few days after the attack and a few days after the patch had been out there and working, that you could literally see tens of thousands of systems that hadn't been patched.
Hmm.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
You need to have a policy that covers emergencies. You may have a standard policy that says, before we run a patch, we want to test it and make sure it's not going to break anything. But there are classes of patches that are unlikely to break something and are very likely to be exploited by the bad guys if you don't apply them.
Hmm.
So, probably the first rule is unless there's a reason not to, you should believe that the patch was put out there for a reason and use it. And if you're a librarian and you're relying on the IT department to do that, the thing that I would strongly recommend to all my colleagues at universities is to have a feedback loop, that there should be some messaging from the technology department that says, hey, we've applied these patches. You're good to go.
Hmm.
So that it's not a matter of wondering, yeah, gee, did they put them in yet? Do I have to call? Just keeps it cleaner. So I think that's really the first thing. The second thing is to ask a question. And that question is, if we were hacked, how would we know it?
Yeah.
One of the things that we see at Kroll all the time is that a hack occurred and nobody noticed. And it went on for a considerable period and nobody noticed. I had a case a few years ago, Bill, where on literally Christmas Eve, two FBI agents showed up at a major industrial company's headquarters. They asked to see the CEO. CEO had gone away for the holiday, but the CFO was there. They walked in and they said, hi, we're from the FBI. We want to let you know we've been involved in an investigation and we found out that your systems have been deeply compromised by foreign actors. And this is kind of shocking. And the the question that the CFO asked was, how long has this been going on? And one of the agents said, well, we really don't know. I mean, we know that it's been at least 5 years, but we're not sure how much longer before that. And we see that. We see these attacks that go on and on. They're called persistent attacks. And they're based on the fact that if the bad guy can get into your system in a way that you don't notice, they can stay there and they can steal data over a long period. And they can build multiple return paths so that if you throw them out because you found one way that they got in, they can come back in another way. So being able to detect and respond has really become the norm.
Hmm.
The US government is moving as quickly as they can to require that all federal systems be monitored 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the problem with monitoring is that it takes a certain expertise and it takes a certain ability to understand what an attack looks like. So there are things called indicators of compromise, generally very technical things that you can sometimes see in a system that would let you know that something is wrong. And you can instrument a system, you can put in software that will monitor all of your endpoints, all of your servers, and will report activity back to a central server, which has access to a really comprehensive, we call an IOC, indicator of compromise database, to help you realize that something is wrong and you got to go look and see what it is. The problem is that often you don't notice until something happens and there's a ransomware event. The FBI shows up and says, hey, hate to be the one to break this to you, but you've been hacked. And you don't want
Hmm.
that to happen. So I think universities have to move in the direction that we see government, that we see the private sector moving into, and that is moving from a we'll fix it when we find it to we have to be out there actively looking for these problems so that we can get a hold of them before they can spread throughout the university network and encrypt everything. We want to
Yeah.
limit the damage, we want to mitigate the risk.
Alan, I wanted to circle back to one phrase you used and just get you to define it. You mentioned zero-day exploits. Can you define what a zero-day is?
We all wish that a software manufacturer knew everything that could go wrong with their software. But the reality is that's not happening. Many of the products that we use, operating systems, database systems, learning management systems in a university environment, are so large that there may be millions of lines of code. And those are getting updated in real time or near real time as things change, as requirements change. So it turns out that there's a non-zero possibility that there is a security weakness in software. If the bad guys discover that before the good guys, they can exploit it. And it's very effective because since nobody knew it was there, there's no defense.
Hmm.
And that's called a 0-day attack. It is 0 days since the manufacturer knew that there was a problem.
Right.
And for example, in the case of Microsoft Exchange, which is the most popular email system out there, you can imagine how dangerous it was when a 0-day was discovered in the server software, and the rush that had to go on from the folks at Microsoft to build a patch and to test it internally, and then to get it out there and make sure that people were applying it.
Hmm.
And the reality is that could happen with any software that we use. What that tells me is I need to be hooked in to find out when that happens. And I don't want to have to find out only because Lester Holt tells me on the NBC Evening News, but that I understood that because we're getting information from all of our vendors. If we're working through third parties, that it is clear to them that we want to know and we expect them to know. So it's really all about managing expectation and
Hmm.
putting the tools into place so that if somebody knows something is going wrong, that they blow the whistle
Right.
and that we can react to it in as near to real time as we can.
Hmm.
You just heard from Alan Brill. Alan is Senior Managing Director, Cyber Risk at Kroll, a corporate services firm specializing in valuations, cyber risk, corporate finance, and regulatory compliance, among other services. Alan founded the firm's high-tech investigations practice. This episode is sponsored by Springer Nature. Join us next week as we examine the importance of training. We'll also hear one librarian's story about a hacker's repeated attempts to gain access to a database full of sensitive national security data, and Alan's analysis of what happened next.
You know, what this shows you is that these hacks are not something that you should think of as being carried out by some individual in their basement who has no life, but that this can be a very, very well thought out, well coordinated campaign where they will use every trick in the book to gain access. And what it all comes down to is their job is to make you trust them.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.